Welcome, everyone. I'm Elaine Denton, a coordinating committee member with the CMY Solidarity Coalition. Tonight, we'll hear a presentation from Matthew Kouba from Star Voting, an alternative voting method. Matthew contacted the CMY Solidarity Coalition through our Facebook page a while back and offered to do a presentation for us. I personally haven't heard about Star Voting before that, so I did do a little research and looked at some of the materials on the website, and I thought that this was something the coalition would be interested in learning more about.
All right. Hello, I'm Matthew from Star Voting New York, and I'm here to talk about voting reform and the Star Voting Project. The idea is that your vote should be just as powerful as mine, no matter who you are, where you live, or how many candidates are on your side. We should be able to vote our conscience without worrying about wasting our vote, and the candidate who best represents the people should actually win. In our current system, anytime there are more than two candidates in the race, vote splitting can leave majority coalitions divided and conquered, allowing a candidate opposed by the majority to win. To avoid a worst-case scenario, voters strategically vote for the candidate on their side, who they think is most electable. We're all pretty familiar with that. But voting for who we think is electable and not who we actually think can win sets the stage for a whole host of other problems. Oh, I think this slide was off from where I was reading from. Oops. But yes, this slide does demonstrate that effect where if you have two candidates, our current choose one elections work fine. But in a competitive race, oops, I went forward a screen, apologies. In a competitive race, vote splitting under our current choose one elections can leave majority coalitions divided and conquered, allowing a candidate who's opposed by the majority to win. Vote splitting, as was just demonstrated in that graphic, leads to the spoiler effect, where a candidate who is opposed by the majority can actually win. Voters who aren't strategic risk wasting their votes. Factions, usually in the form of parties, must gatekeep prospective candidates to prevent vote splitting on their side, but this magnifies barriers to entry for new candidates. Vote splitting can happen in any election with more than two candidates, and when it does, it hurts the consensus-supported candidates in the middle. So by design, it drives a wedge and increases polarization. Over time, we believe this is why you end up with two great parties. Which methods eliminate vote splitting? This is only a handful of examples, but these are the ones that you're most likely to hear about or encounter when talking about voting reform. Star voting, ranked robin, approval voting, and then systems that don't are our current choose one plurality voting and ranked choice voting, which mitigates but does not eliminate vote splitting. A voting method eliminates vote splitting if it allows voters to support as many candidates as they like, allows voters to support candidates equally, and counts all the ballot data that voters give. If a voter can show they support all the candidates on their side, this is blocking me from reading it, then factions can coalition to prevent being divided and conquered. That's quite literally what vote splitting is well, going off script a little, when voters are not able to show that they support their entire coalition on their side. So what would we want in a voting method? A voting method should be simple. It should be easy to vote, easy to understand, easy to tally, implement, and audit. It should be honest. It should be safe to vote your conscience. It should be expressive. Voters are able to express their full opinion in star voting. It should be accurate. Winners reflect the will of the people as best as possible. And it should be equal. The system does not put some types of voters or candidates at an unfair advantage. And here's where I introduce, star voting, I've already talked about it, but with star voting, you give your favorite candidate 5 stars and your last choice is 0 stars, and then score the rest as you like. The magic of the 5-star ballot is that it lets you show your preference order and your level of support. Is your second choice great too, just like your first? Or are they a lesser evil? That's the data we need to find the winner who best represents the people. STAR stands for score, then automatic runoff, and that's exactly how it works. With star voting, you only have to vote once, and the ballots are counted in a 2-step process. The first round is the scoring round, and the 2 highest scoring candidates are the finalists. The second round is the automatic runoff. Your vote automatically goes to the finalist you scored higher. The finalist preferred by the majority wins. Star voting eliminates vote splitting, and so it's safe to vote your conscience without worrying about whether or not your favorite is electable. Star voting is highly accurate with any number of candidates in the race. So for nonpartisan elections, there's no need for a primary. You would just vote once in the general election. Vote spoilage is nearly impossible. As well, I would like to add that star voting brings the benefits you would expect from having a primary to elections that currently don't have primaries or would find it very difficult to implement them for like small government elections. Statistically, STAR is shown to deliver the most representative results over any other developed voting system. That is why we at Equal Vote have backed STAR voting. It's equal, accurate, honest, expressive, and simple. And Equal Vote is the primary organization behind STAR voting.
Matt, I don't think we're seeing your slides advanced. We're still on the ballot.
Apologies. Yeah, I find the speaker notes thing to be a little awkward. But yes, this is what you should have been seeing. So let me just quickly score, then automatic runoff. The scoring round, you can see that you can score your candidates 0 to 5, the automatic runoff. And this is how results would be presented normally. In this case, we've added up the votes. Oh, that is a slide about ranked choice voting. We've added up the votes, and we've added up the scores, and you see who the 2 highest scoring candidates are. And then we see all of you've counted each ballot for whichever candidate they preferred based on those scores. And so you get that 2-step process here. I believe this was, Sarah, this was the end of the actual the slides the full set of slides, right?
No, I think that was the glitch where Safari wasn't showing you the whole deck.
Mm-hmm. So just continue from here then?
Yeah.
Right. So when we talk about voting reform, we have to talk about ranked choice voting. What is ranked choice voting? Ranked choice voting is also known as instant runoff voting because that's roughly how it works. Voters rank candidates in order of preference, and you cannot give the same ranking twice. Let me see if I can move this so that it's out of my way. When RCV is counted, votes are counted in rounds. If a candidate has a majority of remaining votes in a round, they're elected. Otherwise, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated. In each round, your vote goes to the remaining candidate you ranked highest. If your vote is unable to transfer, it is discarded. ranked choice voting has some clear pros and cons. It's for pros, it's a more expressive ballot than what we have, and that's, you know, inarguable, and that's great. Being able to choose one is awful. It more positive campaigns. It allows jurisdictions to skip the primary election if desired and get similar results as if you'd had a top two runoff general election. And it does mitigate the spoiler effect in elections with only two front runners. But the cons have to be considered as well. Voters rank candidates, but most rankings given are not counted. It depends on the order of elimination. Selectively ignoring ballot data can skew election results. Those whose favorite is eliminated, but whose next choice isn't counted, are unfairly disadvantaged in ranked choice voting. The candidate preferred over all others by voters can lose in ranked choice voting. Elections with 3 or more competitive candidates are the most likely to fail. Measuring public opinion. In 2012, an exit poll in New York City looked at voter behavior under alternative voting methods. Choose One was compared to approval voting, to 5-star voting, and ranked choice voting. In this graphic, you can see the results of Choose One compared next to approval voting and 5-star voting. And one of the most interesting effects is the way the candidates flip around. Obama won by a landslide with all methods, as you would expect in a New York City precinct. But 5-star and approval voting results also showed support for the third-party candidates. And in this case, the result to me makes more sense, because in plurality, the blue graph, you see that Obama is first, and then Romney comes in second, which is an odd result, in my opinion, when you have like nearly 89% or so supporting Obama. It just seems like, you know, that's very characteristic of this electorate. And when you use a voting method that uncovers that hidden support, in this case, Romney actually, he doesn't, but he's last place of those who aren't write-ins. And that makes a lot more sense to me, that you'd have a series of closer candidates being more competitive in this election. Let me see. In this graphic, the results for ranked choice voting and Choose One elections are compared. And you can see that the results, blue for plurality voting, our current Choose One, and red for ranked choice voting, don't change that much. If there's a clear winner, RCV only counts first choices. So plurality and RCV results looked almost identical and barely showed any support for the losing candidates. And this is dramatic for these candidates. I mean, in this case, Stein's example, she can claim third place, but it's certainly not fair. And it's a very odd result. Again, I find, I'll leave that there. Measuring polarization. No, I think now I've gone beyond the slides. Have I, Sarah? Oh, you're muted.
These next few are the ones that I just added that you were asking for from the simulations from Jonathan Bright.
Yeah.
So if you want to cover them, go for it, or if not, feel free to skip.
All
They
right.
should be self-explanatory, or
Yep.
I can explain them as well.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is these graphics show the results of a simulation done by Jonathan Bright, a fellow New Yorker. And what these graphs represent is simulated elections, and showing where each system tended to elect most of its candidates on a it's a left to right spectrum, but it doesn't align ideologically with what we think of as left and right. It's more generic, but it definitely can, right? This graphic shows the candidates at the center of public opinion have to compete with competitors on both sides of them, which makes them especially vulnerable to vote splitting. Candidates in the middle are most likely to lose, even if they have the most support. And you can see that here as we get to the middle of what voters think in this election, because that's what the left to right represents. The center is the center of public opinion. Candidates actually start to lose the closer they get to representing the most voters. So in a graphic like this, you get this sort of valley effect where most of the winners are to the left or the right of where the public is. Go ahead to the next one. If there are only two candidates, the most representative candidate will win. Winners will generally reflect the same distribution as the voters. But when we move to elections with 3, 4, 5, or more candidates, vote splitting, strategic voting, and the spoiler effect leave us with a much more polarized set of winners. Again, candidates in the middle of the political spectrum are mathematically disadvantaged with our current choose one voting system. So you can see as you go from 3 candidates to 4 candidates, you start to see that curve appear. At 5 candidates, it's a very odd shape. And you also just have to think about how, oh, well, I went to the next graphic. Ranked choice voting effectively prevents the most polarizing candidates from the far edges from winning, but it still has a strong visible center squeeze effect, which is what we're referring to when we say this valley in the middle where candidates who manage to appeal to most voters start to lose. And you can see that ranked choice voting does prevent candidates at the very far left and right, extremely unrepresentative of public opinion, from generally advancing forward, but it also has a very strong center squeeze effect. So this means that winners will still be polarized into 2 artificial extremes, and the system will create 2-party domination over time, because as you can see, there's 2 peaks. With star voting, assuming a good representative candidate exists, winners will accurately reflect the center of public opinion, even with more candidates in the race. Candidates from the polarizing extremes don't win, and candidates in the middle have a level playing field and a fair shot at winning. As you can see in this graphic, it compares ranked choice voting's results to star voting's. And you can see star voting, even as the number of candidates goes from 3 to 4 to 5, it heavily preferences selecting the candidate that represents the most voters. And it doesn't sort of divide what voters can get into 2 polarized extremes like the choose one voting and ranked choice voting do. And that sort of leads into the more sciencey background of it, but voting method accuracy. Studies like this one model realistic election scenarios and measure how often each voting method is expected to pick the most representative winner. Each method is looked at with honest voters, blue dot, with strategic voters, the red dots, and with different voter behaviors for different factions. I like this graphic with the fun text and like the colorful arrow. But you can see on this graphic, I think it's somewhat self-explanatory, that star voting sits at the top of the charts, plurality voting, choose one, sits at the bottom, and you can see a little progression with each. And this is generally how we order what we think the best voting methods are in the order shown here, right? So star voting best, approval second best, and so on. There's more than are shown on here, but star voting is at the top, and that's why we advocate for it. What's being measured here, voter satisfaction efficiency, is the technical term, and Dr. Jameson Quinn came up with that. Okay.
Question.
Yes, question.
Lynn, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much. Thank you for the presentation, Matthew. I was wondering about what is the like when this is measuring satisfaction of the voters with the result of the election, do we know why star voting has more satisfied voters?
I would say that it is because star voting measures the two major metrics we have for determining what it is that voters want. Generally, with star voting, we say it's the depth and breadth of support is what we're measuring, in the sense that, one, it is asking, when you score all the candidates, you're getting an accurate view of how the voters feel about the entire field of candidates they've been given. You can tell who was their favorite, who was their least favorite, and everything in between, and it's all counted at once, which is why, approval is similar, except you can only say yes or no. That's why it gets so high up on there as well. But then star voting also, with its automatic runoff, it measures as well direct preference, head to head. This candidate I preferred over this candidate over this candidate. And because we're using both of those metrics to pick the winner, you're just getting a more accurate result by collecting more data and using more data and using it effectively. But I don't know if Sarah would want to answer this question as well, but she's here to answer.
Yeah, I'm here to add anytime I can be helpful, but that was a great answer. So yeah, depth and breadth of support. And I think with a ranked ballot, it feels quite expressive, but there's no way for a voter to show if their second choice is just as good as their first choice, or if their second choice is a lesser evil who they really would only support if there was somebody much worse on the table.
Yeah, so. And I think that is an important part of the answer, that yeah, the reason why ranked choice voting falls so much lower is because all it asks is, do you like this candidate more than the next? And doesn't ask the voter at all how strongly they actually like each. I mean, they could rank 10 candidates and they could dislike every single one of them. And you wouldn't be able to tell.
And then I think the other reason we see ranked choice voting doing worse than we would expect statistically is because so many of the rankings just are never counted. So I think most of us, when we first learn about ranked choice voting, we assume that if your favorite can't win, your next choice will be counted. And that's kind of the pitch that we hear. But there are a lot of different scenarios where your next choice might be gone already by the time your vote can transfer, or for the candidate who comes in second place, the election is called and those voters who preferred the second place candidate will never have their next choice counted. So that's often a huge swath of the electorate who maybe should have voted lesser evil because their next choice was never counted and their favorite wasn't able to win.
Yeah, and that is why it is important, what I said about how also collecting a lot of data and just using it well. Ranked choice voting doesn't use all of the data you give it. So there are methods that exist out there. I mean, star voting technically is one of them, that looks at all those different consider. Yeah, I said on an earlier slide, being able to show your support for all candidates that you support is the key to not having your coalition, your side, whatever you want to call it, divided and conquered in the election.
And one thing I could add, we try to keep it to voting methods that are really being seriously proposed, but for ranked voting, ranked choice voting as we use it in New York City is, it's actually a newer innovation. It was created as like a workaround to make hand counting ranked ballots simpler 150 years ago, but the original ranked choice voting or ranked voting has you actually counting all of the rankings. And if you do ranked ballots and count all of the rankings, you do get statistically way better results. It's just confusing to explain, and it's definitely harder to hand count. But
Right. Sorry.
Yeah, so we do have a ranked method called ranked robin that we recommend for people who are set on a ranked ballot if you still want to get those good results. But star voting has a much better kind of path to victory in terms of like legal compliance. So there's other factors to consider as well.
And yeah, I believe I'm at the end of the slides that are like essential, right, Sarah?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
I could look at what's up next.
Because I also have the second
Yeah.
point. I feel like I'm going a little bit too.
Yeah, there's
here.
one more scorecard that kind of sums up some of the bigger comparisons,
Yeah.
and then there's just the ending slide.
Okay. So this is the single winner voting method scorecard. And it looks at some of the issues we care about and compares the leading voting methods. With choose one plurality, you know, the first issue of concern would be spoiler effect. Does it have vote splitting? Can voters be defeated by having too many good choices? With choose one plurality voting, the answer is yes. With ranked choice, 3 or more viable candidates, yes, it can happen. And with star voting, it cannot. Does the voting system give an advantage to certain types of candidates? With choose one plurality, it favors polarizing candidates and candidates who are seen as viable. Ranked choice voting continues to do that, but to a lesser extent, and that's to be fair to it. And star voting does not. Does it have wasted votes or exhausted ballots? Is there a point where a voter's information they gave out simply doesn't count? In choose one, not voting for a front runner is usually a wasted vote. In ranked choice voting, exhausted ballots are not counted in the final round. With star voting, that does not occur. Ballots being tabulated locally is an important one. It's just a question of who counts the ballots and how is it brought together to give a result. And you know, it's one of the things that we often don't think about with voting reform. But the way we count ballots now is each precinct usually counts the ballots and then reports the result. With choose one plurality, obviously you can do that. With ranked choice voting, you cannot do that. It will change the order of candidates being eliminated and change the outcome. With star voting, you can continue to tabulate ballots locally. Tabulation complexity is just how hard it is for election administrators. And as well for voters to understand what happened. With choose one, add up the votes, that's all you do. 2 elections needed, be it a primary and general election or a top 2 runoff like California uses. Ranked choice voting has multiple elimination rounds and vote transfers, but only 1 election is needed. With star voting, add up the stars, add up the votes, 1 election. So they're competing on the same level there. Just the VSE scores again. For choose one plurality, 72 to 86%, ranked choice 80 to 91, star the best. And strategic voting incentives. And this is a really important metric. And this is just how much are voters expected to benefit from voting strategically for the winner, I'm going to vote for the candidate who has a chance, etc., versus how likely they are to benefit from voting honestly. Choose one, it's 17 to 1. With ranked choice voting, 2.7 to 1, which is a huge improvement, but that we can do better. Star voting, 1 to 1, there's no stronger incentive to vote strategically than to vote honestly, which is important because if too many people are strategically voting, what happens is that everyone's sort of playing a game of telephone, and the actual support of candidates gets lost because you think, oh, well, I need to vote for this candidate because my neighbor's going to vote for them, and there's no way the candidate I like can win. And your neighbor's like, well, there's no way the candidate I like can win, so I got to vote for who my neighbor's going to vote for. And you don't really know. And that runs away with distorting the outcome. Yeah. So you don't want to bury candidates' real support with strategic voting or get really bad outcomes. And yeah, I think that covers this chart. So the other thing I wanted to, because I don't want to go too far over, I think I'm supposed to, do we have a Q&A session?
Yeah, I would think so, yes.
Yes. Yes, I was hoping so. So I just want to be quick about this because New York City was also brought up. And that's the great thing about New York. We have municipal home rule in our state constitution. And what that means is that we have a right to change our local elections and structures of government to however we need them locally to be. It's a very rarely used power. We got it in the 1930s, and only New York City and Port Chester have actually exercised it for voting issues, with Port Chester using cumulative voting to defend the right of marginalized communities to have representation, and ranked choice, and New York City using ranked choice voting to try and make their one party dominated city a little bit more open and democratic. But what that did when New York City did that is it gave us a bunch of precedents. It gave us a bunch of legal opinions and officials' opinions on how home rule can be used today. And so every local government in New York, by default, if they do nothing, their system of voting and how they run their elections is defined by a statewide general law. But if they pass a local law changing their elections to anything that they want, that takes precedence, and that's how their elections are going to be conducted going forward. And I find that most people I talk to don't know about this. They've never heard about this. They just assume that this isn't part of home rule powers, and it is. So you could, I'll just pick a random place, Syracuse could go ahead and adopt star voting, and they already have the power to do that. And especially important within that is that cities in New York State are granted under a home rule power extension the ability to have ballot initiative and referendum. It's not just New York City. So cities like Syracuse, like Rochester, like Binghamton can actually change their voting system through ballot initiative. Even if their local charter doesn't say anything about ballot initiative, state law has actually provided for that. And so I just want to thank the people in New York City for reviving the discussion of home rule and local elections, because fixing our voting system and making voters more powerful begins at the local level in New York State. And we're lucky to have that ability. A lot of states, you have to ask the state government to give you a positive vote to be able to do anything locally. So, and I think that would be the end of the presentation, unless there's anything that I should have covered but didn't, Sarah.
I think that was fantastic. If you want to go to the next slide or the one after that, that just gives a couple of links on like how you can learn more, how you can get involved. But you're through it, and then maybe end the slideshow so we can see each other's faces.
Yep. Yep, you can learn more at starvoting.org and equal.vote, and how we can help, how you can help, recommend star voting for adoption. There is a ballot initiative campaign in Oregon. I'm not sure that that's super, they could always use donations. Sign up for updates or come to an event, which, hey, you did. All right. And how do I release share? I believe stop the share. There we go.
So with this system, so you can vote, so someone who gets like 3 stars, but if they're like the top ranking candidate, they could win with 3 stars, and then you could see that they don't have, like, they're not the top, like you can see the level of support that they had.
So it's, each voter gives each candidate stars individually, but that only represents that individual voter's feelings on that candidate. So you can say that this candidate is my favorite, they have 5 stars. This other candidate I also like a lot, they 5 stars or 4 stars or whatever. But yeah, you can have a candidate who you gave 3 stars and you said, look, I like them, but they're not my favorite and they're not that bad either. Because I'd say that's about what 3 stars represents. And if it turns out that other voters really did like them and the election is going to be between them and someone else, then what that 3 stars did was it didn't give them as much of a boost as you gave to your favorite candidate. But since, you know, with an election, you are working with other voters to choose a common representative, it means that if it comes up to a candidate that you gave 3 stars to, and the other candidate is the candidate that you gave 1 star to or 0 stars to, we now know which candidate you preferred, and so where your vote should go. And that's sort of what we mean when we say it brings the benefit of a primary election to places that don't currently have a primary, is that it does a great job of finding who the top 2 are among a wide field, and then every voter still gets to specify which of those top 2 they actually wanted.
Yeah, and I'll just add, in that runoff round, your 1 vote counts as 1 vote. So if it comes down to your favorite versus your worst case scenario, your vote ultimately counts as 1 vote. If it comes down to your 3-star candidate versus your 1-star candidate, your vote is 1 vote for the candidate you preferred. If it comes down to your worst case scenario versus a 1-star lesser evil candidate that you also really dislike, that's a really interesting case, because in the current system, you're a voter in the minority, your vote is not going to make a difference in the current system because none of your favorites stand a chance. But in star voting, even if it comes down to your worst case scenario versus your second to worst case scenario, your vote counts as 1 vote for the finalist you prefer. So you really get your cake and you get to eat it too.
Okay. And then with the ranked choice voting, so does ranked choice voting kind of work for like more like 3 candidates, but then when there gets like more than that, that's when it kind of like the tailing just is too complicated. So in this system, it can handle more candidates for the star voting. Okay.
Yeah, the great thing about star voting is that no matter how many more candidates you add, the tabulation, the counting does not get more complex.
Okay.
But also the accuracy, as we saw in the 1 chart, really doesn't change that much. It arguably gets better the more candidates you add. Whereas, yeah, with ranked choice voting, once you get to 3 candidates, the effect of vote splitting starts to appear. And the more candidates you add, the more likely it is that you're going to get a result where a candidate that the majority didn't want is able to win. And of course, the tabulation does get complex. You can end up having, 16 rounds of counting. And yeah, that introduces room for error that doesn't really need to be there.
Flynn, did you have a question?
Does that mean that ranked choice voting would not eliminate the need for a primary, but star voting would, because you can have a whole bunch of people? Is that
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Is that a reasonable conclusion from what you said?
I think that it is, and in my opinion, that's correct. I would recommend, like, for the parties in New York City, that they continue to run primary elections, because, yeah, the more candidates you introduce to the general election with ranked choice, the more likely it is that it's going to pick the wrong candidate. Whereas with star voting, you can have as many candidates as you want, and it's not going to make any noticeable difference on the accuracy or on making the result more complex. So with star voting, it's one of the things that I love to advocate about it, is that you can have, let's say 5 Democrats running an election who all represent different parts of their party, or you can have 3 Republicans, or you can have Working Families Party, 2 of them running alongside 5 Democrats, for an example, and it's not going to result in the wrong winner being picked. It's actually going to allow them all to fairly compete. So you don't need a primary, but some people like to still have a primary to make sure that the number of candidates in the general election is not particularly large. And the rest of the world doesn't struggle with that, having lots of candidates. For some reason, we assume in America that voters just can't handle having a very good, nice, diverse set of candidates, but I don't agree. But nonetheless, you can still have the Democrats, for example, could run their primary with star voting, pick 1 candidate or 2 candidates to advance to the general election, and that would narrow it down. And they would both be very broadly representative candidates as well. So you don't need to have a primary. And that also is what's very good, is that in like places that don't have a primary, especially in New York, we have these local elections that are very one-party dominated right now. So you really get 1 candidate from the one party who's going to win, and then all the other candidates who are mostly irrelevant at that point. And this opens everything up to a fair playing field. But as well, you also can, let's say, like in my town, it's very overwhelmingly Republican. Well, now there's going to be, since that's where, if that's where the electorate is, they really want a Republican. Okay, but now we're going to have 3, 4, 5 Republicans running, and we're going to get a meaningful say over who actually wins the election and different policy decisions. And that's one of the things that helps to fight against corruption as well, because now all incumbents do face the chance of being unelected, even if they're from the favored party in that district.
Belinda, do you have a question?
Yeah, well, not a question, but so much just a point of discussion, because I'm originally from San Francisco and I've been involved in politics there, and now I'm in New York City, so ranked choice voting in both places, but I've seen sort of oddball results in elections with 3 viable candidates with ranked choice voting. And I've also seen elections going to many, many rounds of eliminations with ranked choice voting, where lots of candidates get eliminated and gradually a winner emerges. But then by the end of the election, by the end of all those rounds, there are many voters who haven't ranked either of the winning 2 candidates in the final count, so their ballots don't affect the outcome. And usually the number of people whose ballots are exhausted in that way is larger than the margin between the 2 leading candidates in that final round. And so that is something that has caused me to move away from supporting ranked choice voting, and something that I think is interesting about star voting is that it doesn't have that effect. So anyway, I'm just really interested in this presentation, and thank you so much.
Thank you for attending. Thank you to everyone who attended.
Yeah, thank you. I've been a supporter of ranked choice voting too, but then it is confusing the tallying and how it actually is implemented. So when I learned about the star voting, it was really interesting, that the fact that you could say you could vote for one candidate twice, where you could say this one's a 4 and this one's a 4. That's kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Are there places that are doing this?
Right now there are 2. No, right now there is a statewide initiative in Oregon to adopt star voting, and there's also a bill in the legislature to adopt star voting, as well as there. I believe there are 2 counties that have ballot initiatives going up in Oregon in the future for star voting. For use cases, the 2020 Democratic primary delegate selection for the presidential election used star voting out of Oregon. The Independence Party primary of Oregon for president also used star voting. And the Multnomah County Democrats in Oregon use star voting for all internal elections. And then there is probably some more private groups that are using it for internal elections that just don't publicly state it. Like I just found out recently, the Syracuse Libertarians use approval voting for all of their internal elections, and they don't advertise that they do that. So I don't know if Sarah has anything to add.
Yeah, I'll just clarify a couple things. We had legislative bills in Oregon and Utah 2 years ago in the last session, but not this round. This year, we're looking more at the ballot initiative process now that we're coming out of the pandemic and we can actually meet people face to face. And so we have ballot initiatives in Eugene, Oregon, and statewide. And then there are a number of other jurisdictions considering star voting for municipal elections, but to date, we haven't gotten it adopted by an actual city or county. And that's mostly because star voting is the newest of the alternative voting methods. It was only invented in 2014. So it's just now appearing in the peer review, and we're finding, really the science is pretty unanimous that this is a chart topping method that does perform really well and really delivers on the promises of ranked choice voting, because I think a lot of us were pretty well sold on what ranked choice voting claimed, combating polarization or better majority winners or claims like that. But in a lot of places, those claims are somewhat rounded up or oversold. So turns out election science has come a long way in the last 150 years. So this is really the evolution of decades of study and research by an entire field. And we're just trying to bring it to the people.
I'm just wondering if some of the third parties in New York, like Working Families and DSA, would be very interested in trying to promote this.
Yeah, I've been doing a pretty consistent job of trying to reach out to these different groups. That's how I learned from the Libertarians what they're using. And they were very supportive. They were like, yes, anywhere you do star voting, we'll be happy to support it. I've tried to reach out to the Working Families Party. They're a little bit hard to reach. I'm not sure why. I've been able to reach out to individual candidates who've seemed really enthusiastic about it, but not reach the party infrastructure. I'm like, I'll present to you, I'll talk about it, anybody. But as well, I've reached out to the Green Party quite a bit. And again, had individual chapters be very on board with like, we support everything, any voting reform with this sounds great. But reaching the actual Green Party of New York State seems to be very difficult. I mean, I guess it's not that surprising. Reaching the state party leadership of any of these parties is difficult.
I wonder too, because I was wondering, because New York lets you have two of the same candidates on different ballot lines, if that causes challenge to implement this, if they still had that in that weird rule that you can have the same candidate but on different lines, or if the candidate would appear on the ballot and then show like that it's like a Democrat and a Working Families Party. Like, I don't know how that would work.
Yeah. Implementation definitely matters with fusion voting is what you're referring to. And it was, we got that about 100 years ago in New York State. And yeah, it's not inherently in any way incompatible with star voting. It's perfectly compatible. The way I would say you'd probably do it is just to have the candidate have a single ballot line with a list of parties that endorsed them underneath it. If it was implemented statewide, we'd have to address the question of how do you count votes when it comes to qualifying for like campaign financing with fusion voting or ballot access. How do you do that under star voting and make sure that we don't leave it unresolved like they did in California with their top two system, and then that was an issue. But for local elections, we don't use the fusion voting totals for anything as far as I'm aware. So there's no real concern about that. Star voting will work fine with fusion voting. You could definitely implement the combining the two in a way that messes up fusion voting. But the thing is, when it comes to at the local level, the whole point of fusion voting was attempting to address vote splitting, saying that, well, if you support, you know, an example I was giving to the Working Families Party candidate recently was like, if the majority of the public in this election supports the Working Families Party and the Democrats, and that's the majority, it shouldn't be possible for both of them to lose because they didn't back the same candidate. And, you know, fusion voting says, well, let's not divide the coalition, we'll just have one candidate. Okay, but what if they don't agree on the candidate? It tried to fix vote splitting by fixing it at the ballot level, the ballot line level, rather than at the voter level, which the issue was, why are you forcing voters to pretend they only like one? Because you're able to just clearly say the voters like both. And if you ask the voters, that coalition's in the majority. That's what vote splitting is when you forcefully split it up. Well, why is the voting method doing that? So the use of fusion voting is so that you can vote for the Working Families Party without causing the Democrat to lose, is the traditional example. Well, at star voting, we solve that, and we solve it at the right point in the election, actually asking the voter what they want and using the information they gave us. We can see that they gave the Working Families Party 4 stars and the Democratic candidate 5 stars, or vice versa, and we know. So it solves the entire purpose of fusion voting, and then it allows fusion voting to take on a new role at the local level, where parties can actually show that they genuinely support each other. Like, they can say, this is our unity candidate, we're both going to endorse them. Because right now people understand what fusion voting is. The Working Families Party backs a Democrat because they don't think they can win their own thing, and they want to be able to show, we have this many votes, we could walk away with those votes, you need to give us a concession. And so it's very adversarial. And so this solves what fusion voting was trying to do, and then also allows fusion voting to take on a new life, where you could actually have many parties come together and endorse the same candidate because that candidate's just that good and they all actually support them. And that could be an interesting tool in fighting polarization in the community and showing unity and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, especially being a candidate, I mean, it's just, oh, how many lines can I get?
Yeah, it's kind of broken in New York State, fusion voting, in more ways than one.
In New York State, is it just cities that can choose their method, or is counties, towns, villages able to do that as well?
All local governments have home rule powers due to the 1936 Constitutional Convention amendments that were approved. So villages, cities, towns, and counties all can change their voting system. The process is that the local legislature, like let's say my town that I live in, town council puts forward a bill, says we're going to use star voting, they pass it, and then a mandatory referendum is required because they're trying to alter their local government structure, and it goes to the voters of that town to approve or disapprove the change. The only places that have a unique alternative process, though, cities can do a ballot initiative. So voters can create a petition, get other voters to sign it, put it on the ballot, pass it, no local legislature involved. You don't have to ask the people elected under the old system if they want a new one. And counties can require by initiative a charter commission to form, and that is appointed by the county. But it is independent, and it can propose to the voters changing some or the entire charter for the county, and they have to adopt a charter at the end. So those are two paths that exist, except there's also Suffolk County has ballot initiative at the county level, and they were granted that by an act of the legislature, just the same way that all cities in New York were granted ballot initiative. So technically voters in Suffolk County could do an initiative as well.
I wanted to add one thing and maybe even raise one more topic if we have time for it. But definitely, because star voting is really topping the charts, and what the science is pointing to, it's really important for local jurisdictions, especially smaller ones, to adopt star voting sooner than later, so we can start to get that real world data. And from statistical analysis, we already know that, you know, even if voters aren't that expressive, star voting still outperforms other options. And we kind of know, no matter what the voter behavior will be, that we're going to get a better outcome. But it's just really an important time for small jurisdictions and local governments to lead on this and kind of be the pilot. And then the other thing that we haven't touched on at all is current events in voting reform. And I don't know if you all were following what happened in New York City with the mayoral election, with the 135,000 extra votes that were added to the RCV count.
No, I didn't hear that.
So what happened there is they implemented ranked choice, and they were using it for the first time. The mayoral election was the largest election, and there's all the different boroughs. So what they're doing is they're centralizing the tabulation across all of the different boroughs. And so they were reporting the first round results and then waiting a few days, and then they report the second round results, the third round results. And around the middle of the process, the front runner, Eric Adams, had done quite a bit of exit polling on how many people and who had voted in different precincts. And he raised a question and said, the total amount of voters in these results seems wrong. And so New York Board of Elections went back and revisited the count, and they realized they had added 135,000 test ballots to the official count and reported it and not caught the error at all. And so luckily they hadn't certified the results. They went back and they recounted everything, and they realized they had made this mistake. But that's the type of mistake that would have been blatantly obvious with any other voting method, because you're just adding up the votes and you're checking your work as you go. And with star voting, approval voting, you're just adding up the votes in each step. Whereas with ranked choice, because you're centralizing it, the local precincts aren't able to, provide any checks and balances. So luckily in New York, Eric Adams caught the error, and he ended up being the winner anyway. It was a bank error in his favor, so that was less controversial than it could have been. But really a big red flag in terms of election security with this kind of convoluted method that's more complicated than it needs to be.
Yeah, I remember the multiple counts, and it was like, what's going on?
Yeah. And then Alameda County, which is California, it's the Oakland, Berkeley area and the Bay Area. They just had a similar thing happen in their general election last November, where they counted the results with ranked choice voting. They've been doing it for 12 years there, so they're seasoned professionals. But 50 days later, they sent off the ballot data for data analysis, and it was discovered that they had actually mistallied all of the ranked choice voting elections and not caught the mistake themselves at all. And so in one case, what they had done is they had not transferred votes that should have in the order that they should have transferred them. And so they eliminated candidates in the wrong order. And in one election, they actually elected and certified the wrong winner. The wrong winner took office, and then the whole thing had to be settled in court with a recount. So that, again, is an absolutely unprecedented election officiation error, and definitely a clear error when you look at what exactly the thing was, but something that's a huge red flag and really preventable, and just shows kind of unnecessary complexity with ranked choice voting. So I think in terms of the rest of New York, if people are looking at, should we just do what ranked choice? Should we just do ranked choice because New York City's doing it? I think it's a big red flag that the very first election they had such a serious implementation error, and that they're not the only ones.
Mm-hmm. And I'd just like to quickly clarify a little bit about when she says centralized tabulation. What that means is usually when you cast a ballot in, your little voting area, they're counted there currently. And with centralized, it means you have to take all the ballots and bring them from every place people voted to one central place and count them all together. And it's because of that, the test ballots were able to be added in, because they were bringing in boxes after boxes of boxes of ballots. They don't know where they came from and putting them together. And the test ballots, I believe, are because they knew it would be so complicated to count. They wanted to do some test counts first, make sure everyone was trained, they knew what they were doing, so that they wouldn't have an error on election night. And they kind of caused their own problem there.
Yeah.
I'm sort of assumed that since we use paper ballots that are scanned when you put it in, that the count takes place electronically from there. And which seems to me is sort of a centralized form of counting, that it all goes directly into the system. I don't know that.
So the way that our voting machines work, I believe, and I'm not certain about this, but I know it works this way in several different states, is that when the votes are counted by the scanner, the machine is not connected to the internet, and it will only count the results at that precinct. And then those results are recorded, usually on some kind of digital media, and then that is collected at some later point. But it doesn't even need to be, because all they have to do is report those results. In the past they used to do it by phone. Now they probably just email the results, and you just add all the results from all the precincts together. With ranked choice voting, again, I'm not sure this is how New York City does it, but I believe the very first rank on every ballot is counted the traditional way that we already count them, and then the paper ballots are centrally taken, and if no one wins the first round, if it requires multiple rounds of tabulation, that's done at the central facility. So if no one got over 50% of the votes in ranked choice voting, because that just uses the precinct spread out one, then the central facility has to start counting and eliminating and counting again and eliminating. So that's why they ran into that error compared to the way we do it with the scanning machines. I don't believe that they use any form of central tabulation during the official results. But I think that I believe that the USB sticks that our voting machines use are then collected and are brought to a central location after the election. But I think that's only for record keeping. I don't think that that's used in the actual counting process.
So with ranked choice voting, they do just physically take all the ballots to one location. And so, but with the current system, as you're scanning the ballots, you have volunteers from all parties who are observing, and that chain of custody is really closely protected. You have multiple eyes on the ballots at all points in the process, and you have cameras. And if you put in 100,000 ballots and 235 results come out of the computer, you can say there was obviously an error. So that's what you lose with the centralization. It just makes it harder to catch errors that do happen. And in that case, that should have been an obvious one, but it wasn't.
All right, any more questions? Okay, are we all set?
Yes.
I just want to say thank you to Matthew and Sarah for presenting to us tonight. We will have this presentation available on our YouTube channel for anyone who would like to share it with anyone else that would be interested in learning more about star voting. And then again, on their website, starvoting.org, they do have some like great, you can like set up an example votes, and I think too, looking at it in an election or in a municipality kind of way is interesting, and probably slowly could get there. But then too, this in our organizations, looking at if we're taking a vote, maybe seeing if this system would work better, to just try it out and to learn more about it. And that's all I have.
Yeah, I'll just say I used it with a group of friends over a writing project, because it just is a good way to measure what are the most popular options and then pick between them. So private usage is also very, consider using it.
Yeah, well then too, like you use it in your regular life, then if we do advance to it in the election part, you'll already be used to it and have more experience with it, and hopefully less confusion. So okay, well, thank you everyone, have a good night.